Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been a while since the last podcast. I've been teaching a lot and supposed to teach a course on Twitter data collection and analysis. But since the API went down, it's been a lot of fun reorganizing that class. So that explains the absence. But I'm back recording, and I have an excellent episode lined up for you today with my guest, Jenny Reich. She is a fellow at the Georgetown Law Center on National Security and one of the authors of the report entitled Social Media, the Canary in the Coal Mine. And we'll be going through that report today, but I could definitely recommend checking it out. There'll be a link in the episode description. And what it is essentially arguing is that social media is a sign for the changing nature of the internet itself, as well as a new class of cybersecurity threats that brings, both in terms of digital harms, but also in terms of potential harms to the national security interest of the United States, which I think have ramifications for other democracies as well. So in this episode, we're going to dive into the report and focus particularly on the major threats that the task force identified coming out of emerging technologies like VR and haptic suits and blockchain, things that we can already start to see with social media, but might snowball as the internet itself starts to change and becomes more advanced. So we'll focus on the threats, and we'll also focus on the recommendations that the report identifies for actions that governments, the tech industry itself, and civil society can take to better prepare us for what the internet holds. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jenny Reich. Again, she is a fellow at the Georgetown Law Center on National Security. Jenny, thanks for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you and dig into this report.
Likewise. So why don't we start out by discussing the report's title, which refers to social media as the canary in the coal mine, both for the future of the internet as well as U.S. national security. Could you unpack that analogy for us in terms of why your task force decided to focus on social media to anticipate future digital security threats?
Sure. So the report actually originated really just focusing on social media itself because there was so much talk about Russian interference in the U.S. elections, social media potentially undermining and dividing American society, issues like that. And so we took it from a place of there are clearly some national security concerns here in social media that the traditional national security community has yet to fully unpack. And so we tried to think about it from a future perspective in terms of there have been some incredible reports done on the 2016 election and on past social media misinformation. I think the Aspen Institute report on information disorder is a great example of that. And so our question was, how can we add value trying to anticipate future threats? Because these technologies are changing so rapidly. You know, there's a brand new headset coming out every 6 months. The HTC Vive just came out 2 weeks ago. How can we look at social media and try to anticipate where things are going so that we can be prepared for it? And as we went, we realized that in so many ways, social media and this concept of content creation by users is just taking over the internet, but it's also taking over everyday life. And it has some pretty potentially concerning consequences. And we really saw that social media as it exists right now really is kind of a blueprint for the future of the internet. And all of the national security concerns and broader physical danger concerns that you might have around what a future social media looks like, you're really talking about the future of the internet, because the future of the internet is probably going to be much more user driven. And so we saw in the same way, you know, the canary in a coal mine analogy, we saw social media as this first step and the concerns around social media as the first warning sign of what's to come for the entire internet as a whole, as internet and social media take over our daily lives.
Yeah, and the report has this really interesting discussion of like emerging tech developments like VR, blockchain, and biodata collection. And, you know, Some of those have a clear connection to social media. I'm thinking about Meta and the metaverse, but others aren't really that connected to social media yet. And so, what I sort of got from reading that overview was that the security threats seem to stem ultimately from private industry investment dwarfing that of government spending. So, might that be the common thread here? That the government has simply lost the capacity to control tech developments, and maybe as a result, its ability to safeguard its national security?
I think that that's a really interesting thread and definitely something that comes out of this report, which is, again, just this idea that the private industry really is where a lot of innovation is coming from now, particularly in the tech sector. You're seeing that in government investments in private industry. And so you're seeing that there is this kind of shifting dynamics around the cutting edge of some very potentially dual uses, what we call them in the national security industry, technologies, things that can be used in civilian capacities, but also have military applications. And there's just so much investment from the big FANG companies, for example, that the government needs to get in on that. And the government just can't match that in some ways because there's just such a wide variety of companies all throwing money at these dual use technologies. I think that one of the main things that our report offers is this focus on the fact that besides just the fact that government is kind of behind the innovation wave, which is not necessarily a problem, right? Like we have developed a free and open capitalist society for the purposes of making sure that private industry can thrive and innovate. This is exactly what you want in some ways. But I think there's this other thread, which is that, as you point out, a lot of the technologies that we mentioned in the report are not considered traditional social media technologies yet. But you can't think about the evolution of a technology in a vacuum. All of these technologies evolve together. So, for example, right now, you may not think of biometric data collection or biological data collection as relevant to social media. But as you mentioned, VR headsets come to be a thing as haptic gaming suits come to develop and the technology finally hits a point of like minimum viability for general consumers. What you're going to see is all of a sudden things like pupil dilation or tracking your sweat or tracking your heart rate are going to be incredibly valuable to those types of technologies. And you're going to see artificial intelligence, which of course is used for ad targeting and such right now, to be taking some of that data in for improved AI targeting. And so I think that one of the things that we really do offer, and the other key theme here, is you can't think about technological innovation in a technology vacuum. You have to think about how all of these technologies are going to collide in the near future and how that's going to produce some radically different results than what you might see if you were just looking at just the development of AI, for example.
Definitely. And although the report was focused on the sort of national security threats, I was thinking that this is going to be pretty cool when we get these sort of haptic suits and taking gaming to the next level.
Oh, yeah. And I think that that's so important, right? And I think this is not a traditional national security issue, right? Like, this is not a guns and bombs type thing that you might normally think about. This really is something that affects all of society and impacts every single one of us in different ways. And we can't lose sight of the benefits. So you can't ban your way out of this, right? Like you need to make sure that you preserve those very cool benefits and those very exciting new opportunities and experiences that are going to come out of this technology. And that type of balancing and weighing is much harder to do under traditional national security frameworks, I think.
Interesting. So your task force came up with a roadmap to address some of the key emerging challenges arising from these developments, and it includes clearly stated recommendations for a variety of social actors, including government, tech companies, and the public. And I'd like to walk through each of those recommendations, but first, can you tell us a little bit about the task force itself and the type of insights collected to build this roadmap?
Sure. So kind of harking back to that point I just made about the importance of recognizing the balance of these all society affecting technologies, we really wanted our task force to represent that. And so we brought together a task force that included venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, federal judges, just a really wide variety of people to provide insights in order to make sure that, again, that all society perspective and that concept that everyone has a stake in social media and the internet in a way that may not be true on more traditional national security considerations, to make sure that all of those voices could be heard. So we recruited this incredibly diverse high-level task force from kind of across industry. Some are traditional NatSec, some are less traditional, but all have this kind of broader view of what a thriving American democracy and society looks like. And then we actually tried to inform the task force on top of that with another level of diversity, which was doing interviews with almost 100 different stakeholders. And so that could be everyone from influencers with millions of followers to high-level former officials in the Department of Justice or the White House, to, again, like other venture capitalists, cybersecurity professionals, researchers, And so we really did just try to bring together, and even small business owners and grassroots activists. So we really did try to take the full cross section of who could be impacted by this and make sure that everyone had at least a small chance to say their piece, to make sure that we were able to understand and honor and value this very diverse set of perspectives that really does have a role and have a stake in the future of social media on the internet.
Yeah, and the listeners can check out the report in the episode description, of course, where you have this really cool discussion of like, what are the 10 sort of values that American democracy has? But I think the first task of the task force was to identify what type of security threats we might be facing with this emerging tech. And we could sort of start to see that with social media, but it might snowball in the future. So can you outline the type of threats that we might be exposed to with these emerging technologies, so we have a bit of context for what the recommendations are actually seeking to address?
Sure. So our report identifies 6 prioritized threats. And I say prioritized because the task force considered a really wide variety of potential threats. And we really did try to cut it down and condense it so that it was a bit more digestible, you might say. So our first major threat that the task force identified was information chaos. So that's everything from unintentional misinformation to state-sponsored disinformation, propaganda, just this whole concept of information that is not easy to verify as true or false, or that presents itself as true when it may be some version of false. The second major threat is psychosocial and physical harm. So that, again, is this concept, that, as we know, social media can be potentially addictive, depending on the studies that you read. But also, we brought in this physical element because we did want to highlight that when you're looking at what social media is going to look like in the future, there actually is the potential for physical or emotional harm. When you're talking about, like the heightened emotional responses that VR can elicit, for example, you're talking about the ability to actually cause potentially like structural harm to an individual as these technologies develop, haptic suits. There's potential here that has not yet been realized, but that we want to leave space for in our understanding as we're trying to anticipate the threats. The next harm that we identified or threat was lowered barriers for bad actors. That is, again, this concept that the internet and social media have created a level playing field in some ways for all information. That can be really good from an activist perspective when you're trying to pierce through the noise. That can also be incredibly dangerous now that anyone with a computer and the appropriate skill set can hack into different government databases, can hack into small businesses, can cause all sorts of misinformation and other negative impacts across the ecosystem. And so just that democratization of the tool that is both very good and also potentially very harmful. The next one we identified was loss of innovation. One of the key drivers of American competitiveness is this incredible ecosystem of innovation that exists across startups, across major company development. R&D really is one of our competitive advantages as a nation, and we want to make sure that that isn't lost in the fear of what could be developed. So again, that balancing act is kind of difficult. Then they identified exploitation of power, which is this concept that you are creating some relatively unaccountable, at least in the democratic sense, corporate entities who now have tremendous ability and tremendous power in situations where, as you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, government might want to have a bit more of a thumb on the scale. And you might want to have some stronger accountability mechanisms that exist for government entities in the United States, but do not exist for corporations. And how do you account for the potential to exploit that? I think one really good example is TikTok, who is now currently being investigated for taking data on journalists, allegedly, and thinking about how companies with tremendous amounts of data and power might use or misuse that in ways that don't always conform with what the US government or what individual Americans might think of as their best interests. Finally, we've got negative externalities. And this, again, comes from the idea that there are always second and third order consequences to what you do. And in this particular context of the internet and social media, there are consequences that our current system does not account for. So one easy example might be that a lot of people in the journalism industry who we talk to are concerned that the development of social media business models mean that journalism is no longer as well funded or as prominent as it has been in the past. And maybe that's contributing to some of the distrust and other broader problems that we're seeing in society.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on a few of these as we move through the episode, but I'd also like to get to the recommendations as well, which the task force came up with 80 of them, and then you boiled it down to three. And these are sort of aimed at what sort of government can do, what tech companies themselves can do, and then what civil society can do. So I'd like to walk through each one. And starting with government first, the key top line recommendation is to codify protections against digital harms while providing funding for research around them. And so I wanted to ask you picked up on it in the previous question, but what exactly are digital harms and what role can governments play in addressing them?
So I think digital harms are just that. Essentially, an easy short list would be that list of threats that we just went through. But more broadly, right, again, back to that concept of social media addiction, for example, which we don't really understand. At least the data that I've seen, there's not quite enough research there yet to truly understand it as a concept. But there could be. So understanding and funding research so that we can understand and we can say with some clarity where the negative consequences are of this technology. So what the task force identified in terms of where governments can go is there are a number of ways that governments, for example, could seed grant programs, either to the development of technologies that aren't necessarily going to be super financially lucrative from a traditional capitalist sense. Again, back to that negative externalities issue that need to be accounted for, but that could be really valuable, for example, from a cleaning up misinformation context. So that's one way that government can say, these are technologies that are incredibly valuable, perhaps for reasons that a traditional market-based system won't reward, and so can develop different grant programs in that space. Another potential option would be looking at where disclosure could occur. So one of the big problems that we've talked to researchers who have identified is that we really don't understand the algorithms. There's no algorithmic transparency, you might say. And so the importance of establishing a research consortium, either internationally or even just domestically, to try to understand why algorithms give people the ads they do, what is going on statistically, how are we seeing these statistics, can we get broader and better quality data sets to researchers? That's something that tech companies may not want to do beyond the amount of data sharing that they're already doing, but that's an area where government can step in and potentially try to push for more of that. I think you'd see, for example, Congresswoman Lori Trahan's bill or push for an international research consortium is one example of that. And the Congresswoman was actually a member of our task force.
Yeah, I saw that. And yeah, she's super active in this space. And, since we have a lot of academics listening to the show, I'm wondering what type of research you see in the sense that, is it only that from universities, or do you see research coming from other sectors of civil society as well?
I think that research broadly definitely needs to be incentivized and needs to be supported. I think that you're seeing a lot of research coming out of the tech companies themselves, which is great and is certainly something we want to encourage alongside academic research. I think the one thing that we ran into as we were doing this research is we actually talked to activists, for example, from Hong Kong or from Russia. And one of the things we heard was by pushing too much for data transparency, you're actually able to de-anonymize a lot of that data. And so to the extent that that data gets provided, for example, to government for ostensibly government research purposes, that can also be used to de-anonymize and identify dissidents and potentially put them in danger. So you're always walking this tightrope with information transparency disclosure, even for research purposes, which is the one reason why I wouldn't say that the task force necessarily came to the conclusion that everyone should get access to lots of information from a transparency perspective, because you do need to balance transparency on this information front with the very real impacts that could have in countries where people are being targeted for their beliefs and for their posts on social media.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you really get at that with this kind of multi-stakeholder task force. And one of the recommendations is to create a multi-stakeholder federal research agency where the laws and policies proposed should be technology neutral. And so I'm curious about what technology neutral means here. And it made me think about the current politicization of tech around free speech and content moderation, this kind of thorny question. And what I was thinking is that given that attitudes towards tech regulation are sort of splitting along partisan lines, do you think approaching technology as neutral or finding bipartisan tech policies is even possible in the near future?
So when we say technology neutral, we are taking it more from the existing literature perspective of laws that don't necessarily apply to one particular type of technology. So I think the best example of this is, the Communications Decency Act, which birthed Section 230, which has been called the 26 words that created the internet, is one example of that was passed in 1996. They had no concept at the time of what Meta, what Twitter, what TikTok would become. And that is still the regulation that kind of underpins a lot of the development of social media as we see it today. So for us, the perspective of technology neutral is this concept that we can't predict the future as much as we might be trying to, for example, with this report. We can't predict it. And so we need to develop regulation that is flexible enough to be able to accommodate where the developments in technology are. And so from our perspective, technology neutral just means regulation that is flexible and that is agnostic to what the finer points of the technology are going to be, as long as we can come back to, as you mentioned, those democratic principles.
Yeah, and I know you're just about to answer this, but I just wonder, isn't there a risk that this is sort of hard to develop in this sort of broad way because it sort of gets weaponized by one side or the other in terms of, promoting harmful speech versus, silencing conservatives, for example. And so I just think that it just seems to me this is going to be a tough balance to strike.
I think it absolutely is going to be a tough balance to strike. I think you're seeing that in the current debates over what technology regulation could look like. For example, the judicial system in the United States seems to be taking the first major steps in these cases coming up with Gonzalez v. Google, Twitter v. Tamna, and potentially with the net choice cases that may be coming next year. I think you're seeing that there's kind of a jockeying among the different branches of government to figure out who's going to take the lead on regulation. I think in an ideal world, it would be Congress. But as you point out, there's a lot of polarization. I think the one bright point for me personally that I've seen is that there is a want for action on both sides of the aisle. It may be for completely different reasons, but the fact that everyone agrees that the status quo is not tenable, I think provides fertile ground for figuring out what a different status quo could be. So no one's going to be 100% happy. But if everyone is sufficiently unhappy with the current status quo, I actually think that leaves some room for hope. And that policies like technology neutral, things that are a bit more agnostic to the actual technologies, but speak a bit more to core values, may actually be able to get some traction.
Definitely. And I think the report does a great job sort of providing some recommendations in the form of a digital bill of rights to protect citizens and a developer's code of conduct for platforms to abide by. And both of these initiatives are linked to the argument that platforms need to exhibit trustworthiness, high ethical standards, and respect for digital rights. And I'm totally on board with these ideas in theory, but I also wonder, is there any legal pretense for tech companies to enact these high moral standards relative to other types of private enterprise or publicly traded companies?
Thank you for the question. I think that one of the things that we've seen is that, as you mentioned before, Congress is gridlocked. There are not a lot of legal precedents on which one can rest their laurels to try to force through some of these ideas, except to the extent that we have these Supreme Court cases coming up. But what we do have are an incredibly vibrant civil society in the United States. And I think you see that in some of the other recommendations in the report, which is that we need grassroots, we need activist groups, we need GLAAD, who puts out a social media index every year, to be, putting forth ideas, putting forth statistics on hate speech and the way different groups are being targeted, so that we have this groundswell that pushes tech companies to act on their own. And as you point out, they're probably not going to act without that level of civil society pressure, but that's why we have these different elements of society that need to push and that need to be able to have a platform from which they can advocate their interests.
Yeah, I'm curious about this code of conduct, because we've seen this coming out of the EU around disinformation, for example. And this essentially encourages a model of self-industry regulation. And the report argues that self-industry regulation is in the tech industry's best interest, which it may be, but isn't this a continuation of the current model, which I would argue really isn't working? For example, I'd point to the promises of tighter industry-wide collaboration after the Russian disinformation scandal, and then a complete divergence of policies around political advertising. So my question is, how might a digital bill of rights or a code of conduct go further than the broadly laissez-faire approach taken by governments and the judicial system?
So I think I want to take a step back for a second, because I think that one of the really valuable offerings of this report is that the report is looking at things from a long-term perspective as well as from a first steps perspective. And so the report offers democratic principles, solutions criteria, and decision-making frameworks that can help inform future efforts. So the idea of the task force was not to solve the entire problem right now, but was to say, for those who are going to come after us, we know that there are going to be future reports on this. We sincerely hope that other people will be thinking about these issues. What are the fundamental values and what are the key criteria for what makes a good solution that we know aren't going to change over time? Let's create that type of just underpinning foundation that other groups can use as they go forward so that we've done kind of that first step of the hard work for them. Then I think the second part of what the report does is say, okay, what are our goals in the ultimate? And so, for example, we want responsible platforms, effective governance, an empowered public. And then what are the first steps that need to get us there? So I think everyone on the task force, well, I don't want to speak for everyone. I know I certainly would agree that the steps that are offered as recommendations are a first step. And the task force intentionally didn't want to look at what steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 need to be, because as we talked about earlier, the technologies are evolving so quickly, it's really hard to say what those are. But knowing where we want to go, which, for example, would be responsible platforms, I think that a really good and important first step is getting engineers to understand their role and their responsibilities as people who we had one stakeholder mention are essentially the new developers of, like our new infrastructure. Like the people building the bridges of today are 20-year-old coders who may or may not have gone through a college digital ethics program. And so we wanted to introduce some element of ethics and responsibility, almost like a Hippocratic oath that doctors take or the bar oaths that lawyers take, to create that sense of understanding the gravity of what we're entrusting them with in society. So I think as a first step, it's a good start. I think that I personally would agree that the first step is not where you end, it's where you start.
Definitely. And I know I'm asking tough questions, but I love the report for the fact that it does have these like very clear recommendations that is often missing in sort of this kind of gloom and doom approach to social media, right? Like it's undermining democracy, but then the solutions provided are often quite messy. But getting back to the third one, which deals with the public, it's basically arguing for better digital literacy initiatives, as well as agency over personal data and the ability to collectively mobilize. And as an educator, I love the focus on critical thinking, but I also know that it's one of the most difficult things to teach. So what's the roadmap here in terms of empowering users both psychologically against digital harms as well as politically through fostering engagement?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the way we're able to engage on this. So I think that's a great way to break it down conceptually, is that we've got the psychological as well as political elements that require different types of empowerment. So on the psychological front, even just informing people and building those critical thinking skills can be a really powerful way to help students and to help the general public develop the tools needed to discern truth from falsity and to also be aware of how to do that in their day-to-day online engagements. So Finland, for example, has great models on critical thinking education, and the report talks about the need to begin educating students as young as kindergarten on how they should be critically thinking about different technologies and different information that they come across as they engage on the internet. I think another key element to that, which also kind of ties into this need for political empowerment, is the importance of in-person engagements, particularly when you're talking about small towns where you have really strong in-person social norms about how people should behave and how they should interact with one another. I think that there's a really important element here that's often missing from the conversation, which is how do people on the ground interact with each other on a daily basis, and how do you translate that into the online interactions? How do you reintroduce the very strong social norms around good behavior that tend to exist in the physical world, but that are almost completely absent in some circles on the internet? And so I think that that's important from a psychological perspective of getting people into the headspace that when you're on the computer, it's not just you alone in a room. You can cause real harm, and you can also do great good. And then also, how do you, from a political perspective, turn that type of social norming that occurs and that intentional social cohesion that comes out of these positive interactions that can occur on the internet into the types of grassroots advocacy that I mentioned earlier as important to show technology companies where the public is and where consumers want to see reform, whether that's for their privacy or for other issues, for more control over what they do see on the internet. You need that type of political development and political cohesion that really does start, I think, with on the ground individual interactions and a true education around how to think critically about what you see online, what tools are available to you to help you in your critical discernment online, and also how you can come together in like-minded communities to make sure that your internet experience and the internet experience of your kids is a healthy and happy one for a broader society.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about offline interactions sort of having this, they're completely different. If you just looked at what, is on Twitter or generally on the internet, you would think that like democracy is decaying and human society is sort of falling apart, but actually offline interactions are still pretty good. So I think that's an interesting kind of way to see things.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the values of the approach that we took is that we really did try to interview, as I mentioned, a diversity of stakeholders. And that was a key point that kept coming up in our conversations with members of rural communities. And I think that bringing that perspective is so valuable and also can offer these kind of innovative solutions that aren't normally at the table or that you wouldn't normally think about, certainly not in a national security context.
Definitely. And I thought one of the really interesting points in this part of the report was a discussion of empowering user agency through interoperability standards across platforms. Tough word to say, but it seems particularly feasible through self-industry regulation and standards and might also help bring some order to a kind of increasingly chaotic social media landscape. So could you recap this idea around interoperability for us?
Sure. So it definitely didn't start with us. This is something that's been in the literature for a long time and is one of the reasons I personally am really excited about the concept. But it's just this idea that if you are able to take your data, take your digital identity or your profile, all your pictures, whatever it is that matters to you, and use it across different online platforms, maybe in the future, it's your digital avatar in your favorite t-shirt. And you can wear that t-shirt whether you're in, like one company's vision of the metaverse or some other completely different vision of the metaverse. The ability to kind of vote with your feet is so important in much of the physical world in terms of like what companies you choose to interact with. But I think it's also going to become increasingly important in the digital world. And so that's what interoperability, this complex concept functionally means, is the ability to take who you want to be and to change that and transport that across different aspects of the internet. Right now, we exist in what are considered walled gardens, is the term in the academic literature. So, for example, you can't take your pictures on your Facebook profile and take them all over to your TikTok account to make videos, right? Well, a hopeful vision of the internet in the future is that you might be able to do something like that. And so how do you get there? And one of the reasons you want to get there is that what it does is it changes some of the power dynamics in the industry because it gives users the ability to move out of social media networks with all of their data at a much lower individual cost than might exist in the current world where you lose everything you had on your one social media profile when you try to switch to a different platform.
Yeah, and those are those network effects that keep us sort of locked in, right?
Exactly. Yeah. From everything that I personally have seen, at least, the best way to combat network effects is to give people the option to vote with their feet. And the way to give people the option to vote with their feet is interoperability and data portability.
Well, that's perfect because it leads to my last question, which has to do with the interoperability of these suggestions to other democracies outside the US. And, I think the threats that you outlined before, as well as the democratic values that these recommendations seek to protect, are not exclusive to the United States. So kind of getting outside the American national security interest for a second, do you think these recommendations are better accomplished on a transnational scale, given that these are companies that operate globally, or should the US seek to pursue its own model in a way that fosters innovation in tech and sort of comes with all those first mover rewards as well?
To that, I will say, stay tuned, Michael, and dear listeners. We have actually a report on the international threats of social media and where we see the best ground for international action on social media. We have that report coming out this summer. So I absolutely think there's going to be a lot of overlap between these two reports, but there's also a lot of areas where things are a little bit different. So some solutions that make a lot of sense in one context may not in another. So I think a really good example of that is the EU push for data transparency looks really great in an EU context. Other countries, India is one that comes to mind, might be using some of that information or that push for transparency as a way to kind of force and leverage more regulation and more outing of activists on platforms.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely stay tuned. And, from what our listeners could hear, it's a very in-depth report. So I encourage everyone to read it. And Jenny, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing its research with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be able to talk a little bit more about this report that the center put out.
I've just been speaking with Jenny Reich, fellow at the Georgetown Law Center on National Security. Check the episode description for a link to the report we've been discussing entitled Social Media, the Canary in the Coal Mine. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're starting to head into conference season, so I'll be on the lookout for interesting studies to report here on the podcast. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.